Chapter 5. She's not a picky eater. Both men entered the kitchen via the antique four-paneled, heavy oak swinging door. It had held up remarkably well over the decades, despite the number of children who would burst through it, hammering it into the counter on the adjacent wall to the formal dining room. Grown men were usually no different when it came to the abuse of the well-worn old faithful door when they came bursting into the kitchen to find their jolt-givers working hard in the kitchen, preparing their men's breakfast. Gran and Katie were chuckling as they were poking fun at men and their little testosterone-filled idiosyncrasies. Gran was scrambling eggs in the pan, while Katie was doing battle with the bacon splattering, trying to sop up the mess. Bacon makes such a mess, doesn't it? Sometimes I think weeks after it's made, I'm still finding bacon grease in a remote part of my kitchen, Katie quipped. But of course, that's when Scotty is making it. Men have no clue how to clean up after themselves, huh, Gran? This is true. I think if women had work benches out in our sheds or garages, instead of dark splotches of grease all over, I think our tool chests would be spotless, shining, and the wood shelves would still look as though it came fresh from the lumber yard. Maybe, my dear jolt giver, that is because we are more interested in getting the work done correctly, so we don't have to go back and do it all over again after you've attempted to fix something and it needs to be rebuilt, Gramps said, leaning over to kiss his Emma. Nick laughed. Don't you go laughing, slob. I'm sure that your bachelor pad is probably trashed most of the time. Oh, wait, never mind, you must have a cleaning lady. I'll bet the entire First World Fund that you let your mother still do your laundry. Nick dropped his head, not wanting to admit to it, but having been nailed by Katie. Oh my gosh. You do. You let your mother do your laundry? Gran, what is wrong with your daughter, have you taught her nothing? I have to have a talk with that woman. Honestly, that's disgraceful. What are you, 22? I'm almost 30. Case closed. Gramps and Gran both cracked up as Nick looked at his Gran, who shook her head, giving Nick the eye. Part of growing up, my dear son, is not only putting less than 4 large spoons full of sugar in your coffee, but it's learning how to turn on a washing machine and sorting out your darks from your lights. Katie laughed, holding her belly. 4 spoons full of sugar in your coffee? Oh, you've got to be kidding, what are you trying to make, coffee syrup? They are the small spoons, Gran, and I've cut down to 2. Does he even know a tablespoon from a teaspoon, Gran? She shook her head no. Nick's eyes told the rest as he lowered his head. Katie snickered as she got out the measuring spoons, and then tableware. You see this, darlin'? This big one is a tablespoon, now repeat after me. This tablespoon is 3 of these teaspoons. Katie laid them all out by size on the dinette table and cocked her head to the side, looking up at Nick with her eyebrows raised. Do you want me to demonstrate? Nick studied the size of the spoons. No, I think I can handle that. Tablespoon is bigger, 3 of these, he said, pointing to the smaller ones. Wonderful, my stupendous studious star. She stopped short, pulling in her lips, with a guilty look for almost saying it. Nick jerked his head and looked down, pointing and waving his index finger at her. She wrapped her tiny hand around his long finger, giving him a giant-sized jolt. I didn't say it. I caught myself. I'll reserve that title for just Scotty, my felicitous facile friend. He looked down at her, while she gave him a flirting smile. For a second they were back at that restaurant, and she let her body fold into his, falling into him. He wrapped his arms around her in a friendly hug, thus she noted his increased heartbeats. She pulled her head out of the hug and looked up at him, in admiration like she did so many times that night. His longing for her and increased breaths gave her a shiver, and she indulged in that shiver, burying her head into his chest, wishing those 2 past years away. When she pulled out of the hug, they stared at each other, both wanting the same thing, but knowing the time was not right. Katie continued to live in denial of her love for him with everyone else, but admitted her want of him to herself. Gramps and Gran watched as these 2 star-crossed lovers got lost in a lover's wanton gaze of each other. They looked lovingly at each other, remembering such a time in their lives, many decades ago. Gramps winked at his wonderful bride, nodding, letting her know in his mind how sure he was that they would be together. She nodded back, also loving the moment, but feeling pity for them both. They were trapped in a time warp that held them captive and was keeping these two hearts apart for a spell. Katie backed up from the heat of the man with whom she was trying not to love again, or rather trying to love as just a friend. She picked up the spoons, and patted Nick on the chest, giving him another jolt, which he did a better job at hiding this time, and they both turned toward Gramps and Gran. She nodded, winking at Gramps, and he nodded at her, winking back. Gramps, why did you have to spawn such a handsome, sexy, and suave young man, making all us ladies go mad for him, she said as she walked over toward the octogenarian and hugged him. Nick kept his back toward Katie but kept his dimples and Texas-sized grin in play, loving that remark. He turned, trying not to show his appreciation, but his dimples spoke otherwise. She looked up into his eyes and read the pleasure in them. Damn you, Nick Thomas. She immediately flew her hand to her mouth and looked with horror at Gran. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry, Gran. She turned toward Nick. You see what you do to me, you big oaf, you turn me into a bumbling idiot, and if Matthew were here, he'd have my hide for that language, especially here in your grandparents' home. I'm really sorry, Gramps. They both chuckled, and Nick broke out in a hearty laughter. He got behind her and put his hands on her shoulders to comfort her in her most embarrassing moment. Gramps broke the tension by letting her know she was free to change if she wished. Your bags are at the bottom of the steps, sweet lady, he said. Good, I'm dying for a shower. She put the spoons back in the drawer, walked over to the chair, pulled the blanket from the back of it, throwing it around her shoulders and headed for the swinging door. Aren't you going to eat, dear? Gran asked. I'll grab a little something after my shower. If you'll just leave the pan there, I'll make a little omelette for myself after their scrambled eggs and bacon are made, and Nick washes the bacon pan. I'm not all that crazy about maple-flavored bacon, but I don't want to be any trouble. I'll clean up after I finish making my omelette, but I have to shower now. Thanks, Gran. She gave Nick a sarcastic grin and headed out the door with the blanket from the porch swing somewhat wrapped around her. Nick was busy typing in his phone, very focused in what he was typing, while standing near the table. Gran carried the plate of eggs over to the table, then returned to the refrigerator for juice and the bacon plate. Gramps buttered the last of the toast, which was on a plate on the dinette table. Both Gran and Gramps looked at Nick, then at each other. What are you doing, dear? I'm looking up Felicitas, trying to figure if that was a potshot or a compliment. I think facile is a good word. How do you suppose you spell Felicitas? Gran and Gramps broke down laughing. Nick looked at his grandparents while they laughed. It's not funny, she uses these big words, and I have no clue what they mean. She did this all night on our date, and I couldn't look them up. I didn't want to look stupid, but I assumed then they were good words, complimenting me. When I was in the hospital, she used bad metaphorical names, and I couldn't look them up because my head hurt, and I didn't have my phone. He continued in his pursuit as he spoke with his face down, concentrating on how to spell the words. Honey, Felicitas means suitable, appropriate, and sometimes can mean encouraging. Facile means able to perform well, very capable at specific things. She put her arm around his waist and hugged him. She then pulled out a chair for him. So, she's complimenting you, dear. Gramps continued to laugh. It's not funny, Gramps, she uses all these words I've never heard of and then I feel stupid. She even called me tortoise-brained a couple of times when she was drunk. She makes up these funny analogies about me like not having all the bulbs for a full set of Christmas lights, or proof that evolution goes in reverse. That was my favorite. It was funny then when she was drunk, but she's still saying them. Honey, tell her you don't like it when she does that. She'll stop. Oh, calling me dumb I don't like, but all these new words only help me in my songwriting. She's like a dictionary for Pete's sake. Whenever I'm with her, I'm learning new words. She's the metaphor mama. That's what the girls called her. I love her creativity. They bowed their heads and held hands for Gramps to say the blessing. Lord, thank you so much for the blessing of that funny firecracker who lights up our Nikki's world. Help her in what she is about to have to face. Give our Nikki what he needs to carry her through it. Thank you for this food, and oh, for how far our Nikki has come, growing closer to you, and cleaning up the mess he made. Nick raised his head and studied his Gramps to read his expression, wondering which to put emphasis on, the mess he made or how far he's come. I'm very proud of you, son, he said, patting him on the back of his shoulder. Nick smiled. Sweetheart, just casually mention to her that you don't like to be called dumb even if it is in jest. Oh, it's not just me, she does it to everyone, even Matthew. So, I don't feel so bad. If it's just part of her personality and wit, then either accept it and don't take it personally, or ask her to stop, Gran said. Nick stuffed his mouth with eggs as if he hadn't eaten in a week. I think it's funny how she says she's not a picky eater, yet she finds something she doesn't like constantly, like maple bacon. She's already mentioned mayo, white onions, and I had to fumigate the house from the sausage smell from earlier when I made sausage gravy to store in the refrigerator. I had to toss it so that if she went into the fridge she wouldn't smell it, then I put baking soda in there to absorb the leftover odor. Gran, that's a lot of work, you needn't have done that, she wouldn't have complained, Nick said. At the women's conference, someone had put a plate of food in front of her. She had her hand over her mouth and the most sour look on her face, because somewhere under all that food was sausage. She said she was afraid to disturb the food for fear of the odor, because it was the only other thing that would make her sick enough to run to the bathroom. She told me what the other thing was, but this isn't an appropriate place or time to mention that. Gran said with a snicker. Nick laughed, remembering the hospital and how Becca put the emesis basin under her nose to decimate her malice toward him. Gramps looked up, filling his mouth with eggs. He then looked at Nick. Puke, Gramps, she's afraid of it, like Superman is of kryptonite. They both laughed. Nicky, I said this wasn't an appropriate place. Sorry, Gran. He said. Well, my teach is a Yankee from Massachusetts. You should hear the stuff that comes out of her mouth. He laughed. She's hilarious, and quite straightforward, so watch out. There's no genteel Southern belle in her. And that's what you love about her, huh? Nick looked over at Gran and nodded his head. No one wonders where they stand with her. I like that about her. Although, she warned me that she could get me in trouble with some of my celebrity friends. She's not beyond telling a few off. I can just imagine her around Colton Riley. She'd take him down in a New York minute and embarrass him around everyone. I look forward to that day, he snickered. He looked up at his Gran. There were very few people on Gran's list of what she considers disasters in the making, but Colton was top of the crew. That man needs taking down. He's so arrogant and a horrible example to the young kids who are fans of his. Celebrities need to know of the awesome responsibility that comes with fame. Many don't, or don't care. They are just so enamored with the fan worship and self-indulgence. Gran, you sound like Katie. She would be right about many, son. That was why we worried about you. We were so afraid that you had gotten too deep into it. But how grateful we are that your teach pulled you out of it, and brought back our Nicholas Paul. That's because I'm modeling clay, Gran, she pegged me as that 2 years ago, Nick said. I agree, and the finest oil-based clay, Gramps said. Nick turned his head. You read it too? Of course, Nicky, you don't think I wouldn't want to get to know my future granddaughter-in-law? Nick sat up quickly and headed over to the door, hoping Katie did not hear that. What's the matter, son? Gramps, if she heard you say that she'd scoot immediately, not trusting y'all, accusing you of trying to push us together, I'd bet. They all chuckled. I think she knows how we feel. We talked about that a lot when we saw her the first time. Your gran told her how much she'd love to have her in our family, and your teacher cried. She does that, she's funny. She can cry over the tiniest compliment, he chuckled. I think some of that crying was maybe her missing her Nicholas Paul and fearing he'd never show back up, as afraid as we were. Gramps said. Nick dropped his head, ashamed of who he became and the hurt that he caused all. Gramps put his hand on his grandson's back. Remember what I said, the further one falls, the bigger the comeback. Yes, the further one falls, the bigger the comeback, the bigger the comeback, the bigger the man. Nick said. Yes, and the more he appreciates and understands grace with gratitude, Gran said. Nick nodded. Gran, no truer words could be said. Son, that's why I think a prodigal has a closer relationship with God at times than someone who never fell off the straight and narrow road. They have so much more of the understanding of God's grace and are that much more grateful. Nick nodded and Gran smiled, her warm loving smile filled with grace that Nick had been comforted by all of his life. Your teacher understands grace, dear. Why? She hasn't had a prodigal road, Nick said. Sweetie, with what she did to the band after her Michael died, she understands grace more than most. She also has that agape love in her. She's grounded and she'll keep you grounded too. She'll do the work that we couldn't, Gramps said. Oh, that's the truth, Nick said, appreciating the universal love that reigned in her heart. I was surprised she put that in her book. She was so ashamed that night when she told me, but that's my teach. She'll take her worst moments if it will help another get over theirs. She also feels really bad about the way she treated you when you were reunited, especially when you were injured, but mostly when you repented. She said she was absolutely dreadful, and she carries so much guilt around in her heart, Gran said, confessing some of their conversation. She really appreciated how much grace you had for her and all the things she said to you. You were so quick to forgive her, she said. I deserve the way she treated me, and Gran, I love her so much that grace comes automatically. I was so glad to see her, to have found her. Nick said, not realizing that he was going to learn how to extend grace to his teach, surprisingly by the end of that day. You know, as thin and sickly as she looked, she still was so beautiful to me. Nick sighed and swooned. That's good, son. Listen, don't ever mess around on her or give her reasons to be even more self-conscious. You know, she has this complex about herself. She's very insecure. Don't you ever even look at another woman cross-eyed with her around, or cameras flashing, Gramps said. I know. She sees herself as a plain Jane. I see her as just plain beautiful. And that is how it should be, darling, Gran said. She's no cosmopolitan fashion model, but she surely has a natural beauty about her, and in her heart, also. Rare is such a find, Nicky. You remember when I told you that? Remember, all those years ago when we talked about your jolt giver being out there, and God getting her ready for you, and vice versa? Yes, I do, and she is that. God made our jolt givers the most beautiful women in the world to us, maybe not to some, but to us treasured receivers he did. I look at my Emma Grace and she's more beautiful now, to me, at near 82 years old than she was both times I married her. Oh Jake, now I doubt that with all this white hair and wrinkles. Nope, you surely are. He rose from the table, put her face in his hands, and gave her a long, sweet kiss on the lips. He cocked his head toward Nick. Take note, Nicky. He then turned back to his Emma Grace and kissed her again. Nick looked along with pride at the love between his grandparents, with the hope of being that way with his teach in 60 years, or so. I am, Gramps, I am. Emma Grace rose and hugged her husband of nearly 60 years, and then began to clear the table. Gramps turned to Nick, standing over Nick, who was still seated, and put his hand on his shoulder. Nicky, I have a new horse in the barn. She just arrived 2 days ago. Her name is Wanderer. They found her on the latest raid. I looked in her eyes when they were dividing up the horses, and we communicated. I wouldn't be surprised if she is kin to willpower distantly. She spooks easily, but I noticed that when I'm humming, she settles down, much like willpower did when you sang to him. Come on, I'll introduce you to her. I put her in the stall right next to willpower. Gramps and Nick rose to head for the kitchen door, leaving their plates behind on the dinette table. You two go ahead, I'll take care of all these dishes and pans, Emma said with sarcasm. Oh, sorry, Gran. Nick and Jacob moved back and proceeded to clear the table. Go on, go sing to Wanderer. I got this. I think she needs the soothing rich tunes of my favorite two baritones. Thanks, Gran. Nick stood behind his grandmother and towered over the petite stout woman. He bent over and reached around to kiss her on the cheek. Gramps and Nick left the kitchen out the back door, talking among themselves, with Gramps' hand on Nick's shoulder. Chapter 6. Field of Dreams Good and Bad. Katie came down from her shower feeling fresh and renewed with clean clothes and a fresh application of her makeup. She entered the kitchen through the swinging door. As she wandered into the kitchen, she ran her fingers through her freshly blown-dried auburn locks that hung over one eyebrow. Gran was washing the bacon pan, and Katie had noticed that the kitchen was spotless. There were no signs of any food out, even the fixings were all put in their proper storage spaces. She observed the refrigerator handle shining and reflecting a beam of light from the above kitchen track lighting. She opted not to say anything about making an omelet, even though she was hungry. She did not want to disturb what seemed like a sanitized kitchen. Where are the guys? They are out in the barn, dear. Gran gave a quick glance to the back door, and Katie walked over toward it looking out from side to side, trying to spot a barn. She opened the door and saw a distinct and very worn footpath at the bottom of the deck stairs. I'm assuming the footpath leads to the barn, she asked leaning in from the porch, holding the door handle. Yes, it does, dear. Okay, she said. She closed the door and began descending the steps only to be stopped in her tracks when she heard the door open, again. She spun around, looking up to the top of the deck and saw that Gran holding a warmed plate, holding it with a towel. In her other hand was a checked red and green woven cloth placemat, and silverware wrapped in a matching deep red cloth napkin. You just wait a minute, young lady. Come on back here. As Katie ascended the couple of stairs back to the top, she watched as Gran laid the placemat down on the glass deck table with a cloth napkin on top and then the silverware. She placed the plate on the placemat and then pulled a chair out. I thought you may like to eat out here and enjoy the view. Katie looked at the omelet and it looked as if it were made by a professional chef, complete with a parsley leaf for decorative purposes. There was a banana balanced on the side of the plate. Come on, Kate dear, I'm under strict orders, now. Katie sat and looked up at Gran with a loving smile, a different one than she had before. What is it, dear? Gran, Matthew calls me Kate, also. Does that bother you? No, I kinda like it. I had a great Aunt Kate when I was a child. She was a family favorite. You remind me of her, and I say you've been appropriately named, and Kate it is. Katie gave her a loving touch on her arm. She picked up her silverware, eyeing the banana, debating whether to say anything, or just to bring it to one of the men to eat it when Gran wasn't looking. She studied it while she let her eyes go to and fro. Let me guess, you don't like bananas, right? Katie raised her eyes to Gran, who took the banana, and Katie gave her a guilty whimpering type of face. She looked up at Gran with a grateful smile and then down at her omelet and cut off a piece with her fork to devour. Gran disappeared into the kitchen, laughing under her breath. She's not a picky eater, Gran chortled. Katie drew in that fresh spring Tennessee morning air. She could smell the grass clippings, noting a freshly mowed lawn from the day before. The smell of maple bacon permeated the air from the 2 times Gran came out onto the deck. It seemed to rest on Katie, and some fell on her omelet, giving it a maple taste. It was very slight, barely noticeable, but it was there to Katie, real or imagined. Katy became lost in the hypnotic view from the deck of the century-old Colonial, on a beautiful 500-acre field of dreams. She rose from her seat, having taken only 2 bites of her omelette, to stand against the railing, with her hands resting on top. It was as if she were transported back in time. In the early morning breeze, she could hear the whispers of history fanning through the distant fields of emerald carpets of sprouting wheat that early spring morning. She could hear the echoes of the voices of generations of children, adults, octogenarians, and the neighs of horses, along with their cantering hooves. The immediate property was well protected by an old, whitewashed wooden dual-beamed fence, perfectly held with evenly spaced posts rolling along the green graceful hills. Green grasses beckoned from the far side of the fields, which were lined sporadically with clumps of dark and narrow patches of woods. This little corner of the world was Nick's landscape of dreams. It was a land that was full of song, where much of his inspired works of art, many of them still in notebooks, he envisioned, dreamed, penned and hummed. Katy saw faded shadows of a young boy, then a youth, mounted on the back of an equine friend, swiftly rustling among the fragrant pastures and the tumbling light green landscape. That was an era of discovery for the young boy, an age of contemplating life's dark and golden moments. She saw the young boy crumpled and weeping on a field of stubble wheat, locked in a wretched place of solitude. He wept, hungry for change, and in search of truth, while being haunted by memories no little boy should witness, live through, or even be aware existed. The fragrant pastures were dappled with crimson flowers, calling out to the spring's early flying creatures, ready for pollination. She bent over and leaned on her elbows, which were propped on the deck railing. The young deep green new leaves of the sporadic elm trees inside of the whitewashed fence danced in the early morning spring wind, warmed by a renewed repositioned sun. This was her favorite time of year, spring. New births were everywhere. Easter lilies popped up along the west end of the fenced property, with daffodils on the east. Newly hatched young birds were chirping almost as if in harmony, some calling for their morning breakfast, some singing just for the sake of exercising their new vocal cords. The longer she stood there, the louder the chirping became, reverberating in her ears, wooing her to close her eyes to enjoy their melodies. The loud squawk of vultures out in the distant fields forced her eyes open, as she contemplated which baby animal it could be that did not escape the trapping and hunting down of the late-night coyotes. She thought about all the kittens she had lost to those brutal beasts. She started thinking about Scotty, and how when the coyote population would grow to the point of a food shortage, the more brazen ones would venture closer to the house, almost to the mud porch, sniffing out the hiding cats. That was when Scotty would get out his shotgun and execute coyote population control. She closed her eyes and imagined that she was on the second-floor deck of her new home off the master bedroom. A drowsiness overtook her while she leaned on the banister of the large deck. In the blackness of her eyelids, she glared down out into the 20-foot outbuilding in the doorway on her new property and saw a dusty vision of Scotty smiling up at her and waving as he ventured into the darkened building for the day's tools. Her body became tense and rigid as she squinted and thought she saw a faded vision of Michael, who popped up out of nowhere. He meandered toward the doorway to a blackened abyss in that outbuilding. It was pitch black beyond the doorway, and Scotty had disappeared into it without a trace, followed by Michael, who at the last second turned and looked up at Katy on the deck. He smiled and waved, and she heard the echo of